book discussion next year in Havana by Chanel Cleeton. Beautifully written book, a book about love and freedom and hope, which from my point of view, are the most important three things in life. The only things in life worth fighting for, worth living for, worth dying for, the things that stay with us. And I think Chanel does a beautiful job. She's an unbelievably good writer. She has that fervor and tenderness that combines. It feels like El Sangre or something, like the blood of Cuba, or you almost feel it. You can sense it by just reading the book. This strength and the beauty and the emotion, and also the negative side, of course, of whatever happened in that part of the world. She's incredibly good at bringing that across. I don't know her as a writer, so I don't know her history. I believe she probably is maybe of Cuban descent, but it doesn't matter. And I make it a habit, particularly with authors that I don't know very well, not to even understand too much about them before I read the books and or books. I'm probably going to read one or more of her books, and then maybe later on I'll try to read about them, because I don't want to be framed. That's very often it's not a good idea, at least from my perspective. So back to the book. I think a beautiful book again, from a stylistic perspective, just unbelievably beautifully written. But also the story is great. She's a great narrator. She's a very, very good storyteller. The book is about the history of Cuba, Fidel Castro and all that, and then it jumps from the revolutionary days in the late 50s, and then back to contemporary Miami exiled Cuban people. So there's this back and forth, and it's written through the lens of a girl, of Marisol. And I think what Cleeton does the best, I think the one thing that I took away from this book is, you can take a story like the Cuban Revolution, which from my point of view has been retold and retold so many times, and it's quite frankly boring. I don't want to hear about Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and communism and the Cuban Missile Crisis and blah blah blah. Those were important aspects of life, but they're not relevant to me right now. I don't care. But then she did it the other way. She showed the human side of these stories. She showed the human side of things, and it really made me think about myself, my wife. We both come from very similar backgrounds. My parents came from former Yugoslavia. They didn't flee the wars there. They were smart, happy, or lucky enough to get out on time and establish their lives in Switzerland. And my wife, she had to flee Lebanon actually during the war, so she's more similar to the Cuban story. So it made me think about the life of people and the way they perceive things. It also made me think about the nostalgia, which is part of the question I have, same in this book. Why are you even nostalgic about something like Cuba when the country has let you down so many times? So those are interesting questions that I'd like to discuss. This is not even on podcast. It's March 7, 2023. This is Krim Delco. For today, the fund is down 3%. The market's down 1%. For the year, we are up 55.5%. The market's up 4.3%. We're outperforming by 51.2%. Just before I go into the book discussion, I think what's happening with the markets right now, we have a recalibration of the interest rate risk. Jay Powell just today spoke, I think, to Congress, and basically reiterated the need to keep interest rates high, maybe even raise them a little bit higher. We're seeing signs of inflation. The last prints of CPI and PPI were not very good. And I think we're having still this need to slow down the economy, which is scaring the markets, and I think rightly so. As far as we're positioned, we extensively spoke about Tesla Investor. I think Tesla is probably the best positioned company in the world right now for this type of environment, because their relentless focus on cost cutting is exactly what needs to happen, on top of all the other innovations and technological breakthroughs that hopefully they can deliver in their products and services. So we're very comfortable with the long-term story of Tesla and the valuation, but we're going to have to, I guess, tighten our seatbelts a little bit for the near future, because of the volatility in the 10-year treasury, which drives the volatility in the market. We believe that there is a need for a little bit more pain in the economy, just so the labor market and the government, which is the key problem, the government has to stop spending money. That's key. And hopefully that higher interest rates will lead to that. There's certainly a risk there that instead of having less money spending, we have the opposite reaction where they raise taxes and all of that, which I've just seen some headlines. But we believe that the institutional framework of the United States is more geared towards productivity and less towards killing the golden goose that lays the golden eggs. So let's hope that that stays, and hope is actually the right transition to Chanel Cleeton's book next year in Havana. It's a book about three things: hope, love, and freedom. So those are the three things. And I think Chanel, I don't think she is a political writer. She doesn't come across to me like that. But she's one of those, you know, I have to say it. I mean, she makes it look easy. She makes it look easy. And if that is the biggest compliment you can give to anybody, if be it John Jones in MMA, Roger Federer in tennis, or a writer, and she's at a very, very high caliber because she makes it look easy. It's not easy to write the story of the Cuban Revolution and be interesting in 2023. I mean, this book was written in 18, doesn't matter. I read it this year. It's not easy because this story has been told so many times. And quite frankly, who cares? Who cares about Cuba? It's a small island in the Caribbean. But what Chanel does, she brings the human touch. And that's what it's all about, at least when it comes to writing. If you ask me, everything, even business, even investing, it's about the people, stupid. How do they feel? And then it's about the three vectors: love, freedom, and hope. Like you can even digest it even more. Excuse me. You can even, like, what is a good story? It's a story about love, freedom, and hope. Those are the only things that matter in life. I want to hear a story about anything else. Even when it comes to if you want to portray a character to me as a writer, talk to me about how he loves, how she fights for freedom or doesn't, or whatever, and where's the hope. Those are the three things. I think Chanel does a fantastic job in portraying this. The plot itself is very well written too. I think very smart. If you write a story about something that happened 50 years ago, you can just write a historical novel, or you can write a contemporary novel and always sort of flashback, or you can write both. And that's what she did. She connected her main character Marisol with her grandmother. Yeah, it's a grandmother or great grandmother. I'm not sure. No, it's a grandmother. Doesn't matter. With an older person in her family, and that person has a whole space in the book. There's a whole character development there, and also the times, which is around the revolution in Cuba in the late 50s. And then there's Marisol, the granddaughter, living today in Miami and visiting Cuba. So this is the story, and then things happen. There's history, family history, and all of that. Now, let me say a few things just about the way I feel about the Cuban Revolution besides the book. Okay, the Cuban Revolution was, and I hate to say it, if I had been a young student in the 50s living in Cuba or even outside of Cuba, I would have been in support of the revolution. And that's how sad the story is, the story of the Cuban Revolution, because what happened there was the right thing to happen, because whatever was before was really bad. It was not fair in a sense that people didn't have the right and the ability to upward mobility and express themselves. They couldn't. You were either born rich in a plantation family or you were poor. And Batista, the dictator, was crazy, and a Banana Republic dictator, like portrayed in many sarcastic movies ever since. The problem with the revolution is not the revolution itself, is what happened afterwards, because it became even worse. And this isn't, now I'm on a tangent here, but I'm going to get back to the book. But this is a very, very big lesson that we all need to learn for today. When we start telling people how to think, that's the beginning of the end. So for all those, emotional vokists out there in the Northeastern universities and even here on the West Coast, just think about it. What are you doing here? You're telling me how to think. You're telling me not to use words such as Christopher Columbus or America, because those are colonialist words. You might have even a point there, but don't tell me how to think. Don't tell me how to think. Because if you tell me how to think, somebody tomorrow is going to tell you how to think. And then we're all going to stop thinking, and we're going to become an Orwellian or Huxleyan or both nightmare. And that's what Cuba has become. So what Orwell and Huxley and many other writers in the 40s and 50s and 60s wrote, and even Nietzsche before, actually happened. So let's take this as a lesson. Let's read this book next year in Havana and remember how bad it can be. I just saw a movie, The Lost City, directed by Andy Garcia, which is a similar topic and really well done. I love the movie. And same thing there. There's a scene in the movie where the father tells the son, who is about to leave Cuba after the revolution, and the son doesn't want to leave, and he says, son, when they tell you how to think, that's the time to leave. So let's take this as a lesson, that we cannot be in a society where we're told how to think and how to talk, where words are being split and used for certain parties or certain groups of society to impose their thinking on others. Let's not do that. Let's keep a pluralistic society. Let's fight for it. It's worth fighting for that. Let's get back to the book. So what I like about the book most is the focus on the human aspect of love and hope and freedom that is portrayed within the context of the Cuban Revolution in the late 50s and the contemporary life of Cuban exiles today. It shows how they think, how they feel. For example, there's a sentence in the book where the character, which is living in the times in the 50s in Cuba, she says, we Cubans, we flaunt our wealth. I find that a very strong sentence. I've never come across the word flaunting, and I think it's a very strong, this by the way, is just credit to Chanel Cleeton. She really has she's an artist with words. She's very good at using words. She's very precise with words. I love that about her. So we flaunt our wealth. And I thought about this. A society that flaunts their wealth is not a sustainable society. My wife is from Lebanon. That society has that similar problem. In particular, the upper classes in Lebanon, they flaunt their wealth even today. This is another tangent, but the person that saved the Swiss watch industry, his name is Hayek. He's a Lebanese person. He came to Switzerland and he redefined the Swiss watch industry along the lines of wealth flaunting, and that was very successful. So while it's a successful business strategy, even today used by companies like Louis Vuitton or Ferrari and so on and so forth, as a political system, as a social system, it's very unstable. So societies like Lebanon or Cuba just can't sustain themselves, and then they end up in a nightmare. Lebanon, unfortunately, is going through this right now. Cuba already went through this 50 years ago and now is still living in this nightmare. Now, what is the problem with the Cuban Revolution? The problem with the Cuban Revolution is exactly that you are told how to think, and you're not allowed to think differently. And I can't emphasize enough how scary and bad that is. You can live in the biggest punishment humans have for people is to be in solitary confinement. But this is even worse. It's maybe not as painful, but not to be allowed to think the way you want to think is a very scary thing. And that's what went wrong with the Cuban Revolution. And it went wrong with the Cuban Revolution because the Cuban Revolution was built on top of a body of thinking and writing, which started with Marx and then was materialized by Bolshevism and Lenin in Russia, and then just proliferated throughout the world in places like North Korea and Cuba and so on and so forth. And the problem with that kind of thinking is there's two problems here. First, what happened in all these revolutions is that the existing system was just transferred, meaning, let's take Cuba as an example. We had a system of plantation owners with a dictator called Batista. That system was just replaced with functionaries and Fidel Castro. And the rich were kicked out, but then there was a new class of rich people, the functionaries, the apparatchiks. And there's a scene in the book, Next in Havana, where the lady comes back to her old house, the house where they used to live before they got kicked out of Cuba, in Miramar, the fancy neighborhood in Havana. And there's Russian diplomats living there, and and Cuban functionaries living there. So there's still this separation between rich and poor, and some people are more equal than others, and all of that. So what these revolutions did is just replace, and that the same, by the way, happened in the Bolshevik Revolution with Lenin. There was an upper class before that with the Tsar and the feudalists, and it was replaced by Lenin and the apparatchiks, and then with Stalin and the apparatchiks. And today we have a little bit more pluralism. We have the oligarchs and so on and so forth. But anyway, I don't want to talk about Russia here. So my point here is that what went wrong with these revolutions is that they really weren't revolutions. They were power struggles between one class of people, and then another class of people just took that power away and instated the same type of system, just used different names. And this, again, on a tangent for today, I want to remind people who are so passionate about what we call wokeism today. It's just one class of people trying to take the power away from other class of people. Let's not go down that path. And by the way, those people who are supposed to lose in that game, they're not just going to give up without a fight. We can get a more fair and just society. We define fairness. We can use John Rawls for that. We can say fairness is in a society is unfair if there are things we can do to improve the worst of society without harming anybody else. That's what the definition of unfairness or fairness is. And we can use that Kantian approach on a social level, and then we can use the more mundane stuff, like the typical stuff, like, why don't we have a decent public school where we enable upward mobility? But when we go towards telling people how to think, when we tell people what words to use, and when we punish people for using certain words, such as, for example, Stanford tried to disallow words like Columbus or America and so on and so forth, when we go down that route, that is, to me, that's when the danger starts, and we have to stop that. So back to the book. I don't want to dwell too much on today's problems that we have. So why am I even talking about books? Why do we discuss books at the Not Even Wrong podcast? Well, the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. And we said many times on this podcast that reading books is not just a pastime of hedge fund managers, it's part of the job. Because reading books is conditioning of the mind, and conditioning of the mind in the knowledge business is the equivalent of an athlete doing conditioning of the body. It's very necessary and incredibly helpful. So that's why we do this, just to remind new listeners why we're discussing books. And this is a great book because it really made me think. I mean, that the beauty of Chanel Cleeton's work is she makes it look easy. She makes you think. It's entertaining and still very deep because it's about humans. It's about love, it's about hope, and it's about freedom. Those are the most important things to talk about in life. There's nothing else that matters. Love, freedom, and hope. You take one of those away, life is not worth living. It's not even one of the three or two of the three. You got to have all of those. That's why we live in California. Sometimes I ask myself, why am I not nostalgic about where I come from? My parents come from what used to be Yugoslavia. They grew up in what's today Bosnia, and they were born in places, even other places. My father was born in what's today Montenegro. My mother was in what's today Croatia. And then they emigrated to Switzerland, and now I'm here in California. Why am I in California? Why am I not nostalgic about Switzerland or whatever? Well, it's because what matters, whatever you're looking for in life, it can be distilled to the three things: love, freedom, and hope. Wherever you find that, that's where life is worth living. And if you don't have that, then you fall into the traps of nostalgia, of nationalism, of religionism, or whatever. Those are things that are substitutes for love, freedom, and hope. And by the way, I'm not an atheist or anything like that. Don't get me wrong. It's okay to have a religion. It's okay to have a value system to believe in. I'm not against that. But what you really are driven, what drives you, the value system is what you fall back to. It's not what drives you. You can't be driven by religion. You can fall back to it to support you on the quest for love, freedom, and hope. That's what you need. Whatever you're hoping for. You can hope for more money. You can hope for better children. That's fine. All of these things. But love, freedom, and hope are the absolute quintessential vectors that define life. And I think this is what Chanel Cleeton's book beautifully, beautifully expresses in Next Year in Havana. And she does that in an artistic way. It's definitely an artistic way because it's done. She makes it look easy, and that's beautiful. So to summarize, I give this book a 5-star rating because it's stylistically very well done. The story is very well written and entertaining and deep, and Chanel hits the 3 vectors that, in my point of view, are the most important vectors that drive somebody, and that is love, freedom, and hope. You can fall back to nostalgia, to your blood, to your nation, to your family, whatever it may be. You can fall back to these things, but you can't be driven by them. What drives you is love, freedom, and hope. Thank you.